I know that was a lot to take in, so we're going to look at some examples of the four I's of oppression from my perspective and in my experience, and hopefully that'll help you make sense of these definitions, four I's. So the goal of this lesson is to learn various examples of the four I's and how to resist them. So first, we're going to start off with institutional oppression. As a reminder, it's when an organization actively oppresses individuals or groups of individuals. Again, this could be from group to group, and examples of some institutions are schools, government, family, military, media, police, the economy, or capitalism. And it's not on here, but even religion counts as an institution. Up next is interpersonal, and again is when an individual actively oppresses another individual. This could be from person to person, from group to person, or from group to group. An example of this, again, is when a student is bullying another student. And internalized oppression is when an individual begins to believe what their oppressor says about them. This could be from the group to the individual, but the most important part is that it comes to the self, internalized inside of an individual, and they accept it as truth. An example of this could be like when I believed my high school counselor and she told me that I couldn't aim to be an architect because I didn't have the math grades necessary to get into a school like Cal Poly. So now I'm going to give a couple of examples from my own life that I've seen institutional oppression. So if you didn't know, and I shared this on the family timeline, is that in the Philippines in 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declared something known as martial law, which forced many people to flee central Manila, and which included my grandparents and my mom and her siblings to flee from the capital city of the Philippines to the provinces out in Pampanga. So I can't really say what it was like to live in the provinces. I've stayed in them before. It's not necessarily the best place to be. Or I guess you could say it's not the most industrialized area as we see many cities like, say, San Francisco, and closer to village life, so to speak. Another example is when I transferred to the University of San Francisco, they wouldn't accept my credits to transfer as a nursing student. And so this is definitely an institution oppressing an individual, where as simple as this sounds, that they wouldn't accept my credits. It does sound a little bit petty that I'm writing this, but in terms of what actually happened, there was a lot in the process of them not allowing me to transfer from a credible institution, SF State, to another credible institution, which was theirs. And they at that point in time, they had created rules where they didn't want nursing students to transfer in after a first or second year because they were having a huge issue with students changing majors. So, for example, you'd be applying to USF as an art major and then change to a nursing major, which was kind of the loophole around the competitiveness of their nursing program. And they thought I was trying to do the same thing, which I wasn't because I was transferring from one nursing major to another. Another example is that a professor told me and my entire class that she believed we would not be able to pass it, that it was too difficult for us. This was a class that I took that was a hybrid of OChem, biochem, and general chemistry, and I still got an A. And don't get me wrong, the class was super hard, but she constantly told us that we weren't capable of passing this class. I'm not sure why that was her approach to teaching us. And this would be an example of schools being oppressive. And I guess a more recent example, and maybe a clearer one, of institutional oppression is being forced to reopen schools during a pandemic, right? The government is forcing and using their institutional power to actively make another group of individuals, in this case, teachers and students, to go back to school. So interpersonal, between two groups. So one example I have is when I changed majors from nursing to teaching. My parents didn't want me to change my major, and they actively went out of their way to use the power that they had to stop me from being at the University of San Francisco, and they threatened me to be like, we're going to pull you out of that school. We're going to send you to the local community college because of finances and because of the major that I wanted to change to. I definitely kind of fell into that Asian stereotype of either becoming a nurse or a doctor, and they were really upset with the decision that I had made without even consulting them. Another example is that when my girlfriend's old roommate, she would threaten that she was going to inflict self-harm or some sort of act because she didn't have her personal space in the apartment, and that any of her stress was caused by my girlfriend and her housemates, regardless of if this individual was struggling with tests, school, personal life. She just blamed it all on everybody else and was very vocal that she was going to inflict self-harm or do something worse to herself to manipulate the people in their house. A more present issue for myself that I've seen is that other faculty holding things over me because of their seniority or entitlement. I've seen this happen a lot, especially now that I'm in a different position. People are holding grudges against me, even though I haven't really done anything, but they're going out of their way to actively express and demonstrate that they have seniority over me. And for some reason, they feel entitled, that there's some sort of power in that because they've been here longer than I have, or they've been teaching longer than I have. And lastly, with internalized oppression. So there's definitely a lot of things that I've internalized growing up and that I still believe today, and that really made me struggle while I was in college. And they're pretty basic things, but I definitely struggled with not believing that I'm a math person. And Asians fall into a huge stereotype of being good at math. And I know I was pinned as that in high school. But like I mentioned, my high school counselor said I didn't have the math grades to become an architect. And that was around like sophomore, junior year of high school. And I really believed that. And after that, I didn't really do well in math, and especially in college, because I kept telling myself that. Also believing that I'm a terrible standardized test taker, which I know that I am. Even though that this is something that I shouldn't necessarily believe, I've taken lots of standardized tests like the SAT or exams for teaching, or just even to get into certain classes in college. And one of them being there was another math test that, because I did poorly on the SAT, I had to take another test to certify whether or not I needed to be in a remedial math class. And I still failed that test. And it just reinforced the idea that I'm a terrible test taker. For a really long time, I believed that I wasn't a writer or that I was good at essays. In high school, I know I definitely struggled with it as well, because I couldn't wrap my head around all of these things to remember that went into a good essay. Nor did my teachers really help, because they would make me feel stupid or embarrassed for not knowing how to do the analysis that they were looking for, or to see what it is that they were seeing. And a more recent example is thinking that I wasn't old enough, or that I didn't have enough experience to be the English department head. And I think this kind of ties to this idea or notion that we're our own worst critics. And so I personally think pretty low of myself, as we can see in some of these examples, is that I either hear it from someone else and I accept it as truth, or I just have bad experiences and then I create these internalized messages to myself that's like, damn, you're not good enough. So as we reflected on all these examples, they all had the notion of one group or person somehow being better than another, and in some measure has the right to control that other group. And if you remember from reading the Chinook Fund about the 4 Eyes of oppression, it addresses this idea that where there is oppression, there is resistance. And in order to combat that oppression, we have to resist. So before we get into that, make sure to finish this matching pairs activity. It says apply what you've learned, and based on these GIFs and the context in them, which one represents the appropriate eye of oppression. So there's only 3 in here. All you got to do is just click, and it'll tell you if you're right or wrong.